Hey everyone. So I recorded a previous training on this STEM app, and today we're going to be going into a little bit more detail on that. So I was talking about using it as a self-awareness tool, and I want you to use it as that first and foremost. But it can also be used as a tool to help us change how we're feeling, change how we're behaving, change how we're thinking, and that's what I'm going to go into a little bit more today. So this is a really awesome tool. You can use it for so many things. It's so versatile. You can play with it in so many different ways. And today you'll get a bit more of a sense of that. Okay, awesome. So just to recap, um, the STEAM app is an acronym that stands for situation, which is the S. That is the thing that happened, the stimulus, the kind of trigger for what happened. Sorry, just the kind of trigger that happened, or yeah, any kind of stimulus situation, the context in which this played out, right? And this is entirely neutral. So the situation is completely neutral. It's just the facts. It's like everyone would agree on this part. It's not our own story, our own narrative. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between these. We often think we're just reporting the facts, when in reality, we are already putting on our own narrative. So that's why it's often helpful to have someone look at this with you. But there are ways that you can kind of make sure and go back and check. And it really is helpful to do the work to find this neutral situation. So think of it as like if 50 people had to be in a room, they would agree on that. We often use the exact quotation of the patient, for example, or the colleague or whatever kind of triggered you. Like, say exactly what they said. Don't say they were complaining or they were ungrateful or they were making small talk, right? Say exactly what they said. That helps you take the narrative and the emotion out of that to begin with, right? We are going to go into your emotions and thoughts and all of that, but for the situation, we really want it to be completely neutral. Okay, so the situation, the stimulus, the context in which this played out, then the T line is your thought. And what I suggested in the previous one is that you just pick one thought for every map. So you're kind of doing one steer map for one thought. You might have so many different thoughts for one situation. That's totally fine. But then you can almost do it as like a, what do you call those things? Like a mind map of all the different thoughts and their emotions, their actions, etc. Just because thoughts, certain thoughts will produce certain emotions in you, certain actions, etc. And we don't want to kind of get them muddled up. So separate out the thoughts, make it its own map, and then do that for each one of the thoughts. So that's why I put it as just singular. And then the emotions that are sort of caused by that thought or that result from that thought. Um, and then the actions that result from the thoughts and the emotions. And then what is the final result, like almost the bigger picture result of all of this happening. Okay, awesome. So that's just a quick recap. And what I wanted to illustrate today is how we can start to play around with that a little bit. So with the previous training, we just did a map and then we just wanted to see it for what it is, right? To see like, okay, what thoughts are coming up when this situation arises? What emotions are coming up when I think those thoughts? What actions are happening? And then what is the result I'm creating? Not from this situation, but from what I was thinking about that situation, because the situation itself is neutral, right? Okay, so now we start to look at, okay, I've got this awareness now. I can see what's happening in my brain when this particular situation arises, right? Last week we looked at a situation where a patient comes back for their follow-up appointment and says some version of like, I'm still in pain, or things aren't going well, or how long is it going to take, or whatever it is, some version of things aren't going great. Um, And then we get to see, so we quoted what exactly that patient said, and then what thoughts we were having about that, emotions, actions, results. And we just got to see that. So now we get to decide where we want to play a little bit. One option is just to see what other thoughts could I be thinking in that exact same situation that would produce different emotions, actions, results, right? We can start here, and I'll show you how to do that. We can start here. Like, given that a patient comes back and says, I'm still in pain, how do I actually want to be feeling when a patient says that, right? Maybe I want to feel more connected to them. Maybe I want to feel curious. Maybe I want to feel compassion, right? You get to choose what emotion do I actually want to feel when a patient is telling me that exact same thing, right? The situation doesn't change. That stays exactly the same. And then the other option is changing something here. So we want to behave differently in that same situation. We want to be able to act differently, or we want a completely different, like, overall result. Okay, so we can start at different points essentially of this map, and we can play with it from there, kind of like reverse engineering things. Okay. I have a plant in the way. Much smoother. Okay, so let's say we'll go with that same example, just because it's quite a common one when I'm coaching clinicians. Okay, so let's say the situation is patient returns for follow-up. I'm just going to shorten that here, and says, I'm still in pain, right? Or some version of that. It doesn't always sound exactly like that, but you can see, again, I'm quoting the patient, like specifically what they said, so that we don't already add our own narrative to that. And then we had the whole mental cascade that happened, right? And we saw what the result of that was. We end up, taking more responsibility. We end up blaming the patient, or we blame ourselves. We end up maybe doing more, overexerting ourselves, and then feeling resentful and exhausted because we gave so much and they weren't doing much and they weren't meeting us halfway and they weren't grateful and all those kind of stuff, all those kinds of things. Or they didn't listen when I told them they had to do X, Y, Z. Some version of like blaming them or blaming ourselves, like, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible provider, I'm never going to get this right. I know I shouldn't have just done this profession at all because I'm just so useless, or the profession itself is the problem, whatever it is, right? We go on this whole mental tangent, and it's completely different for every clinician. There are obviously patterns because of the way that we are socialized, the way that we tend to be when we choose a career in healthcare. So there are definitely similarities, but just knowing that this is neutral. Different clinicians will have completely different steer maps. Some of them will feel amazing. Some of them will produce the most incredible results. Others will feel terrible and create terrible behavior and results and all of that. Okay. So the patient returns for follow-up and says, I'm still in pain. So you can start thinking about, I find it easier when we reverse engineering to start somewhere here. Oh, that's very wonky. To start somewhere there. It's just easier for us to do that than think immediately about a different thought. And I'll go through a little bit more detail here because I think that's where we might need a little bit more help. But yeah, it can kind of be easier. So let's say that situation didn't change, right? We're never changing the situation. We're not trying to say, like, how can I make sure that patients never come back and they're not in pain, right? There are ways that you can obviously influence that, like maybe in your communication that they know that it's normal, and they're not stressing about it, or like how many appointments they would need before that they would get concerned about it. But even if you communicate amazingly, patients will still come back and say, so we're not trying to control this, okay? We're trying to control this. This is what we have control over. This is the very definition of not focusing on what you can't control, focusing on what you can control, right? Okay. So let's say we say, okay, how do I want to be feeling when this happens? How would I prefer to be feeling, right? And we said some version of like maybe connected, engaged, compassionate. And you want to kind of choose something that you feel would be accessible. Like we don't want to go all the way to like, I'm so excited, but they're still in bed. Like, it's not that. It's saying like, what can I feel even when that is happening, right? So even when a patient is saying that, you could still feel connected to them. You could still say, I really just want to let this person know that I am listening to them, that I'm connected with them, that I'm not going on my own mental tangent and I'm not blaming them, I'm not judging them, I'm not blaming myself or judging myself, right? I'm staying connected. I'm not leaving that situation, that conversation. The other one I mentioned was also curious. Right? Like I just want to get curious when someone asks that because I want to be able to find out more information. Right. So I want to feel curious. Whenever someone says something that's a little bit activating for me, I want to get curious, like, oh, why am I so activated by that? Or why are they saying that? Why do they feel that way? Right. So those might be some emotions that you come up with, right? And then you can go, okay, what would I need to be thinking in order to feel this way? Right. And the thought could be something like, let me find out more. Right. Or I wonder why they're saying that. Or let me listen to their story. It could be thoughts like that. Right. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the thoughts. You could have also started by action, right? Like when this happens and a patient returns for follow-up and says, I'm still in pain, how do you want to be behaving? How do you want to be acting towards them? And maybe you might say, I'd actually prefer to just be able to ask them more questions, right? So maybe you say, ask more questions. Maybe you want to not necessarily change your treatment according to that, right? Like you're still going to do the treatment that you plan to do because you know that this is normal, right? If it was abnormal, right? Like if you didn't expect that they like as in they shouldn't still be in pain, then you might want to change something right here, right? So you might say something here like you might say change treatment if appropriate, right? Or you might say like, I suppose that ties into if it's appropriate, right? Like if it's not appropriate, we don't just change that just because they seem to be unhappy and we need to keep them, pleased and all of that, right? Like we can explain something to them and then we can go on with our treatment as we would have done if this is like expected and normal, right? So it might also be something like reassure them, right? Whatever course of action is appropriate that you would want to take, right? Like obviously sometimes if you didn't expect that they were still going to be in pain and it's kind of a red flag, obviously your action would be different, right? But you're taking the exact same situation. Like we're assuming in this situation it was a patient that you maybe were going to do a couple of treatments for, and it was pretty normal that in that beginning stage that they're still in pain sometimes, and you did explain that to them and you did take them through that whole process, but they come back and they report that, right? So not like we're not thinking of this really hectic case here. Okay. So you might want to reassure them, you might want to ask more questions, you might want to maybe I'll say only change the treatment if it's actually appropriate and not just because they seem to expect that, or they seem to be happy with that. You might reassure them. You might want to explain something again to them. You might want to explain why that's normal, why you're grateful for them expressing that to you, grateful that you, that might be a good one to add here. You want to feel grateful. Ooh, grateful, right? Grateful that they feel comfortable enough to tell you. Grateful that they still came back to their appointment and actually wanted to talk to you about this instead of just canceling or being like, yeah, actually my dog's sick, and which happens too. So you might feel grateful, right? This is very different to the previous map, right? You can go back and look at that. And so we were assuming this was another way to reverse engineer this, right? So let's say we hadn't filled that in and we'd filled in this, like, actually, this is how I want to be behaving. This is how I want to act when this happens. Then we might have asked, okay, what do I need to be feeling in order to behave in that way, in order to do these things? How would I had to be feeling? And then you can go back to how did I need to be thinking in order to feel that? And the result one is pretty similar to this one because they're quite connected, right? Like, what result would I want to be different? Let's say we hadn't filled in any of these things and we just went straight to, okay, what would I want to be different about this whole situation, right? Maybe your end result, you would want to know exactly what they're experiencing, right? Because in the previous model, we were so busy with the mental journey that we were going on that we didn't actually get to ask them more questions. We actually never found out what exactly was going on. We just made certain assumptions based on what they said. And so maybe the result that you want to be different is like, I actually want to know what was happening with them. Like, I want to be able to find that out, right? And in the other example, sorry, I felt a sneeze coming. In the other example, one of the results that came up was that the practitioner ends up over compensating, right? Like, they do more in their treatment, they overexert themselves, they're like trying to compensate for the fact that the patient clearly thinks that something is not going right, right? Or that they think, in that specific example, the practitioner has this narrative that when patients don't take responsibility for their health, I have to do more. And so she ended up overexerting, overcompensating for that, and she ended up feeling exhausted and resentful. So maybe that's the result that we want to change. We don't want to feel exhausted and resentful when this happens, right? So maybe the result that we want to change is that we don't want, well, that's maybe a weird way to put it in this thing, but don't take responsibility for the patient. Right? In the other model, she was starting to take responsibility for the patient because she thought that they weren't doing it, so she had to do it, right? Whereas now we want a different result. I actually don't want to take responsibility for their health or their outcome. That's not my job, right? I show up as the best practitioner that I can. I have a responsibility to my patient to deliver the best care that I can, to stay up to date with knowledge as best as I can. I have certain responsibilities to my patients, but I'm not responsible for their outcome, for their health, right? So maybe that's the result that you chose and you started there, and then you would ask yourself, okay, what behaviors need to happen in order for me to create that result? What emotions would I need in order to do that thing? And then what thoughts, etc. So you can see how you can sort of start anywhere. And you can kind of think about where's easiest for me to access. Like, do I just want to be like feeling differently? Is that where I can start? Is that where I can sort of access that more easily? Is there directly something that I would want to actually do differently? Like, I noticed I was behaving in a certain way and I actually want to do something a bit differently. Or maybe just the result, right? So you can kind of see where it makes sense to you, where it feels more kind of natural to reverse engineer this from, and go from there. So what I wanted to talk about when it comes to the thought. So let's say the previous thought was, we're not taking responsibility for their health. Okay, so that was the thought from the previous model. And maybe we want to, either because we reverse engineered from the rest and now we need to find a thought that creates that, or that we just started at that and we wanted to find a different way to think about this. So there are two main things that we can do, right? The one is we can just start questioning that thought. So we're just questioning, like, is that entirely true that they are not taking responsibility for their health? Like, another way you can ask that is like, can I find evidence in the opposite? Like, how are they taking responsibility for their health? Well, they made an appointment with a healthcare provider, right? They showed up for their appointments. They're paying for their appointments. They're investing in their health, right? So you might not think that they're taking responsibility to the level that you would want them to. That's not what we're talking about here. We're just trying to kind of loosen this a little bit. Like, this is very all or nothing, right? They're not taking responsibility for their health. Okay, let's look at where they are taking responsibility for their health. Let's just like balance that out a little bit, right? And when we do balance that out, it tends to lower the like very intense emotional response to that, right? So you might question it in that way, like, is that really true? Is that entirely true? Can I be absolutely sure that they're not taking responsibility for their health? Maybe another way you can find that that's not true is like, you actually don't know why they're still in pain, right? Like, maybe you're assuming it's because they didn't do the exercises that you gave them, or you're assuming, it's because they didn't follow the advice, right? That was the assumption. And then you question it and you start realizing, oh, I actually don't know why they're still in pain, right? Maybe it has nothing to do with them not taking responsibility for their health. Maybe you might question, what does it mean to take responsibility for your health? Like, let's break that down. What does it actually mean to take responsibility for your health? Does it mean never, ever falling short of a practitioner's expectation? Is that what it means to take responsibility for your health, right? Does it mean if you take responsibility for your health, you will always be able to follow your exercises to a T? You'll never forget a day. You'll never miss out. You'll never forget what the exercises were, right? Like, what are you defining? What are your like requirements to say someone is taking responsibility for their health? So we can define it, we can question the truth of it, we can find some evidence for the opposite. And we're just kind of playing with that a little bit. We're not trying to prove something else true for ourselves. We're just trying to loosen that a little bit. So that's one of the options, is questioning. Then we can also find new thoughts. And this I find is where we often get a little bit, I want to say, resistant, or we just try and do this in an unrealistic way. So we think that we should go from this, they're not taking responsibility for their health, that we should now go to like, oh my gosh, they're taking amazing responsibility for their health. This thing keeps sliding. One of these days, it's gonna like smack into my computer. We don't have to be like, oh my gosh, they are like fully taking responsibility for their health, right? Or like, I love the way that they are taking responsibility for their health, or whatever, right? We don't need to go to the polar opposite. We just need to find something that we believe as much as we believe this. And you can also think of this as like a neutral thought. We just want to have something more neutral. We want to have something that's less like emotionally charged for us, right? So this could be something like, often the a nice bridging thing is like, I'm willing to believe that, because it's like, I acknowledge that I'm not quite there yet, but I'm sort of willing to look at that. Like, I'm willing to believe that maybe they are taking responsibility for their health. You could even say, in some ways, they are taking responsibility for their health, right? Because they're there for the appointment, they're investing in seeing me. So maybe you could say, yeah, in some ways, they're taking responsibility for their health. You could even find something, another neutral thought like, let me find out whether they're taking responsibility for their health. Right? Just notice like they're not as emotionally charged as this, right? This feels very accusatory and very like, it immediately goes to like feelings of blame, feelings of resentment, feelings of maybe anger even. It leads to all those things we talked about, like defensiveness and frustration and anger, frustration. I already mentioned anger, feeling exhausted, feeling like you have to now do more, right? There's so much more charge to that versus like, yeah, in some ways they're taking responsibility for their health, right? Or if you were trying to just find a new thought in that situation, it could be something as simple and as neutral as, let me find out more, right? Like, how does that feel? Feels so different. Let me find out more. That immediately leads you to being more curious. It engages you. It makes you connect with the patient again instead of leaning out, you leaning in. Let me find out more. Tell me more about that. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say here. But yeah, in the finding new thoughts, you're just trying to find something more neutral, or you're just trying to find something that you believe as equally. Like that could be that sentence of, in some ways, they are taking responsibility for their health. Sometimes you can also find what they call turnarounds. You can go back to, I did another video on, what's her name? Byron Katie. She does what she calls the work, and it's just a series of questions. And at the end, you're doing turnarounds. So you're asking the question, is it true? So you could look at that and say, is that true? Yeah, maybe I feel that that's true, right? The next question is that absolutely true? Okay, maybe it's not absolutely true that they don't take responsibility for their health, because I could find some evidence that they are, right? So, okay, maybe it's not absolutely true. This is not, again, you're not trying to argue with yourself. You're trying to sit with those questions and allow it to help you. That can be part of the questioning. And then the other question that she asks is, what happens when I believe that thought? And that's kind of what we explored in the STEER map, right? We can see what happens when we believe that thought. We get defensive, we get frustrated, we get resentful, we do more, we feel exhausted, we take responsibility, we never actually find out what was actually going on, right? So you can explore it this way as well. Like, what happens when I believe this thought? And the other question that she has is, what would I be, what or who would I be without that thought? And I think that's so powerful to think about. Like, what kind of practitioner, what kind of clinician, what kind of person would I be in that exact same scenario if I wasn't believing this thought? Like, if I just dropped that thought, they're not taking responsibility for their health. Like, if I just dropped that for a second and I was actually there with that human being, what would be different about me? What would be different about how I behave? And then at the end of her questioning, she does turnarounds. So you're kind of just finding little ways to turn this around. And again, you're just like turning it around and just seeing like, oh, does that feel as true as the original statement? What do I think about that? Like, how does it make me feel? You're just sitting with it. You're not trying to force yourself to believe something new. That never works. And the reason is because if we look at the STEER map, if that thought if we don't actually believe it, it's not going to produce the emotion that it would if we believed it, right? So we need to find a thought that we actually believe in order for it to create the emotion in order for that to change how we're actually behaving and in order for it to change the results. So the turnaround is like basically taking the sentence and like finding flips, right? So for example, they're not taking responsibility for their health. We might turn that around and say, I'm not taking responsibility for my health. Where's that true? Where's it true that I'm not taking full responsibility for my own health? And we can often find a lot of places. And again, it's not to like blame and like make yourself feel bad. It's just to explore like, oh, there are actually some places that maybe I'm doing this. So the exact same thing that I'm judging them for doing, I actually do that as well, right? But maybe that also might not resonate. You might say, no, I take like full responsibility for my health, right? Again, it's not about forcing yourself to believe that. It's about just exploring alternatives and seeing, is there some other thought that actually feels just as true as this one? So it might be, I'm not taking responsibility for their health, right? And that might feel true, like, oh, actually, no, I'm not going to take responsibility for their health. That's not my job, right? We spoke about that a little bit earlier on. So that might be a turnaround as well. This is an interesting one, like they're not taking responsibility for my health, right? Because we thought in the other steer map, the whole result of that was you're exhausted, you're resentful, your emotional health, your physical health is affected by your thought pattern and by the way that you behave when you believe that and the way that you feel. So your physical health, your emotional health, that is being affected. So are you making the patient then responsible for your health, right? Are you being a victim to how your patient responds? Is your health at like the mercy of however your patient response, right? So that's an interesting one to think about. Another turnaround could be they are taking responsibility for their health, right? So instead of they're not taking responsibility, they are taking responsibility. And that was kind of like we started in the beginning, like just finding evidence for where is that true, that they are taking responsibility for their health. Okay, you might find more. But yeah, these are all just ways to take a closer look at this and just see what the other possibilities are. A lot of what we think about as like emotional health is really a kind of creating more options, right? We tend to have quite strong patterns, and we think in a certain way, and that leads to certain emotions and actions and whatever, and we tend to kind of repeat these patterns over and over and over again without ever considering that there might be another way to think about it, another way to feel about it. And when you find another thought, you can start practicing that, like especially when it's a thought that you already believe. You're not trying to force yourself to believe something. You find something that you already believe, but it's like a muscle that hasn't really been strengthened. It's like now you just want to start practicing that thought. Like what happens when in that moment I'm able to like catch myself, and then instead of thinking they're not taking responsibility for their health, I'm thinking, let me find out more about that. Right? I'm curious why that is. So that will start you kind of strengthening that muscle a little bit, both of catching yourself in that moment, of like being aware of that in the moment. It starts with being aware outside the moment when you're reflecting back. It starts to progress to being in the moment and starting to notice like, oh, I can actually catch myself in that moment and redirect it a little bit and pick a new thought and see how that feels. Or like we did with the reverse engineering, right? You might just say, okay, they said that thing. I'm feeling like, ooh, that frustration, that resentment come on. How can I shift this emotion in my body, right? Let's say you want to feel curious. You say, okay, like, how can I just think about a place that I am genuinely curious in? And like, how can I borrow that emotion? I know what it feels like to feel curious. So how can I just almost like get into that emotional state And then from that emotional state, see how I respond to the patient. There are so many ways to play with this. I don't want you to get caught up in like that it's somehow like really complex. There isn't a right way to do it. I'm just giving you like all the options so that you can pick just one thing to try out this coming week. Just one thing, either a new thought or a new emotion or a new behavior, and just try it out. Just gather data. That's often what we're doing in the beginning. I do this with all my clients in the beginning. We're gathering data. We're trying to find out, what are your habitual patterns? What are your habitual thoughts that keep coming up with patients, that keep coming up in your everyday life as well, right? You can do this in your everyday life as well. And they're often patterns, similarities in our personal and professional, right? But in the beginning, we're just gathering data. You don't even have to change stuff. That self-awareness, you start with that. This is like this whole thing that we did today, the reverse engineering, and also this part, that's more like once you've done the other one and you have a bit more self-awareness, you've gathered some data, you are more familiar with the map, and you also aren't trying to just escape your emotion by trying to find a different thought and trying to find a different emotion, trying to do things differently, right? Often we're doing that with the idea that I can't handle what's happening right now. I feel too uncomfortable. I'm trying to escape that. So I want to change something. And I don't want this to be a tool to just kind of like not have to feel your emotions, right? Emotions are normal. We need to learn to be willing to sit with them, to feel that discomfort without immediately trying to change it or fix it. But this is like a next step to that. Okay, awesome. I hope you enjoyed that and I hope you found it helpful. And I will chat to you guys soon.